The courtroom was cold, not by temperature, but by presence. No smiles, no warmth, just the tap-tap of expensive heels echoing off marble floors and the smug tilt of Judge Marilyn Rowe's chin as she entered and perched herself on the bench like a hawk spotting prey. She didn't look twice at the man in the worn gray suit standing at the defendant's table. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already summed him up. Black, 30-something, no tie, faded briefcase. To her, he screamed public defender, mediocrity, inconvenience. But Darius Cole wasn't a lawyer. He was the accused, and this was his trial. "Mr. Cole," she began, flipping through a manila folder like she was bored already, "you've chosen to represent yourself. I strongly advise against that. This court doesn't have time for theatrics." Darius's voice was calm, measured. "With respect, Your Honor, I don't need theatrics, just truth." A snort from the prosecution side. ADA Brentley smirked without shame. He was Judge Rowe's golden boy, young, white, loud, and overconfident. The trio of them, Rowe, Brentley, and the system, formed a triangle that caged men like Darius every day. The charge was corporate misappropriation. Translation, Darius, who had worked for a major tech firm as a senior engineer, had discovered something ugly: racial bias in AI datasets, and when he tried to report it, suddenly found himself under investigation. Conveniently, security footage of him sneaking out confidential data was leaked to the company's in-house legal team. That footage, of course, had missing timestamps and altered metadata, but no one cared. He was a black man with a backpack. That was enough. And now, here he stood, not only fighting the company, but the judicial system that had always treated him like a glitch. Brentley's opening statement dripped with self-righteous contempt. "This is a simple case, Your Honor. The defendant stole trade secrets and tried to blackmail his employer with false claims of racial injustice. We are not here to judge ideologies. We're here to uphold the law." Judge Rowe nodded, almost too eagerly. But Darius didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, turned to the jury, 8 white, 2 Hispanic, 1 Asian, and 1 black woman, and began. "I never stole anything. What I did was try to save people who looked like me from disappearing into digital shadows." The room rustled. Brentley objected. Rowe sustained it before the word systemic could even reach the air. Day after day, it was the same pattern. Darius presented meticulously collected data, and Rowe called it speculative. He questioned witnesses with surgical precision, but Rowe interrupted often. "Move along, Mr. Cole," she would sneer, or "that's irrelevant," even when he was citing emails from the CEO. When he tried to present his own digital analysis, clean evidence that the company had altered logs and deleted emails, Rowe shut it down. "This is not a tech expo. If you wanted to play data scientist, perhaps you should have stayed in your lab." The room chuckled. Darius stared at her. Something behind his eyes didn't move. Not anger, not fear, just stillness, as if he was watching a movie he'd seen before, one he knew the ending of. By the time closing arguments rolled around, Brentley was already mentally high-fiving himself. He practically danced across the courtroom, weaving his words like thread through a needle, crafting an image of Darius as a disgruntled employee, a failed whistleblower with delusions of persecution. The jury deliberated only 4 hours. Guilty. Judge Rowe didn't even blink. "Mr. Cole, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in federal prison."
Darius didn't blink either, but he did smile. The first real smile of the entire trial. Rowe narrowed her eyes. "Something amusing, Mr. Cole?" Darius tilted his head. "You know what they say, Your Honor. Justice is blind, but sometimes she hears whispers." Rowe looked confused, annoyed. She should have listened harder. 3 months later, Judge Marilyn Rowe entered her courtroom with the same confidence, the same cold dignity, the same disdain for the poor and powerless. But something had shifted, quietly, invisibly. It started with a federal subpoena, then a request for personal financial disclosures. Then came a whistleblower leak. Someone, anonymous, had turned over internal court emails and case reviews, showing that Judge Rowe had habitually blocked motions, suppressed defense evidence, and refused appeals in 87% of her cases involving black male defendants. Her rulings were now under federal audit, and that was only the beginning. Soon, news broke that a digital breach had exposed communications between her and ADA Brentley, communications full of snide comments about urban defendants, jokes about courtroom rappers, and flippant admissions of fast-tracking convictions to avoid dragging trials with idiots who don't know the law. Marilyn screamed when she saw her own words in bold on the New York Times front page. "I love it when they try to play lawyer. Makes it so easy to watch them fall." The article was titled, "Justice on Trial: How Judge Rowe Turned Her Court into a Conveyor Belt." Within days, protesters stood outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Systemic injustice starts with her, and Rowe must go." Marilyn held press conferences, denied everything, called it a smear campaign by tech radicals. But then the video leaked. Footage from her private chambers. Someone had hacked her court security feeds, showing her laughing with Brentley while mocking a defendant who had stuttered through his testimony. "I thought he was choking on his own guilt," she giggled. The backlash was nuclear. The state launched a full ethics investigation. The DOJ opened a civil rights probe. The court suspended her pending review. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, it did. She got a visitor. Not in court, but at her gated mansion in the hills. He wore a pressed suit this time, tie and all, but it was the eyes that gave it away. Still, calm, familiar. Darius Cole. She nearly dropped her wine glass. How did you get in here?" "I didn't. I was invited. By the Congressional Subcommittee on Judicial Accountability. I'm a consultant now." "You what?" "I specialize in data integrity, systemic bias analysis, and the forensic reconstruction of suppressed legal evidence. It's what I did before I stood in your courtroom, and it's what I'll be doing for the next 6 months as the lead analyst on your docket." She backed up. He didn't move. She stammered. "This is harassment. You can't—" "I sentenced you to 5 years for a crime I didn't commit. I served 42 days. They reversed it after the federal court reviewed your trial transcripts, said you violated due process in 8 separate ways. I'm not here for an apology. You wouldn't mean it anyway." Marilyn was sweating now. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Darius turned to leave, but paused at her door. "You once said this court didn't have time for theatrics. You were right." He stepped out. And now the truth gets center stage. The hearings were broadcast live, C-SPAN, YouTube. Every social media stream buzzed as the once untouchable Judge Marilyn Rowe was placed under a microscope. The irony of her now sitting at the defendant's table, in a dull gray suit, no robe, no gavel, was not lost on anyone.
She sat stiffly, flanked by her legal team, her expression controlled but cracking at the edges. Across the room, Darius Cole adjusted his glasses and opened his laptop. A courtroom, sure, but now he was the one with the evidence, the data, the command. The committee chair, a congresswoman from Atlanta, cleared her throat. "Mr. Cole, please proceed with your findings." Darius nodded,
and began projecting graphs, emails, metadata charts, all of it seamlessly laid out in a timeline of judicial misconduct. The kind of work you could only do if you had years of technical training and a personal stake in the fight. Over the course of 10 years, he began, Judge Rowe presided over 1,842 criminal cases involving black male defendants. In 1,632 of those, she ruled against defense motions to suppress. That's 89%. He clicked to the next slide. Of those cases, only 2% of requests for new trial were granted, despite later findings of prosecutorial misconduct in nearly a fifth. This suggests a pattern of habitual denial of due process. "Objection!" Marilyn's lawyer barked. "This is biased data!" "Overruled," the chairwoman said, without looking up. Darius didn't react, just continued, calmly, relentlessly. He presented statistical comparisons between Rowe's court and neighboring jurisdictions, expert reviews, internal memos. And then came the smoking gun, an archived message from her private work email, long thought deleted, unearthed by his AI recovery software. "If I have to listen to one more sob story about bias, I'll scream. They want fairness, get a job, and stop playing the victim." Silence. Dead, damning silence. Even Rowe's own attorney sat back in his chair. The panel of lawmakers whispered among themselves. The black congressman from Illinois slowly shook his head in disbelief. "Mr. Cole," the chairwoman said, her voice sharp with quiet fury, "do you have further evidence of tampered rulings or altered transcripts?" Darius clicked to his final slide. "I do. 37 case files, 3 altered by court staff, 12 with missing pages. In all instances, the irregularities benefited the prosecution." Rowe's face was pale now, her jaw rigid. But Darius wasn't done. He leaned forward, voice calm but heavy. "And to think, Your Honor, once told me justice isn't for amateurs. But this wasn't justice. This was rigged theater, with black men as the props." 2 months later, the headlines were biblical in tone. Judge Rowe disbarred, civil rights violations confirmed, dozens of cases reopened. Her name became shorthand for corruption. Legal students across the country studied her trial as a cautionary tale. Brentley, the overconfident prosecutor, quietly resigned days after the ethics board announced his suspension. The ripple effects were seismic. Some called it the Rowe Doctrine, a new standard for auditing trial fairness in cases involving racial bias. Others just called it what it was: revenge. But Darius never used that word. He didn't need to. Because while Marilyn Rowe's world collapsed, his was just beginning. The DOJ hired him as a permanent advisor. He spoke at tech and law conferences. The TED Talk he gave, titled Code of Injustice, garnered 20 million views in 6 weeks. His face was on magazine covers, but his voice stayed the same, steady, precise, unshaken. One day, after a seminar in D.C., a young black law student approached him. "You really took her down, man." Darius just smiled. "I didn't take her down. She built the gallows herself. I just turned on the light." Marilyn Rowe now lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in upstate New York. Her savings had been drained by legal fees. Her once flawless reputation? Gone. She couldn't go out without hearing whispers. She tried to file a lawsuit for defamation. It was dismissed by a judge who quoted Darius in the closing statement. Justice isn't about who wears the robe, it's about who the robe serves. She stared at the court order, silent. No gavel, No echo, just quiet. The final twist came quietly months later. Darius walked into a small courtroom in Virginia where a man named Leon Boyd had been locked up for 17 years on a trumped-up gun charge. His trial had been short. His judge? Marilyn Rowe. The new judge glanced at the evidence Darius had brought forward, doctored ballistic reports, suppressed testimony. He dropped the gavel. Conviction overturned. Leon stepped out of the defendant's box, blinking into the light. He saw Darius standing there. He didn't know the full story, just that this calm, sharp man had helped free him. He gripped Darius's hand. "Why'd you do this? You don't even know me." Darius looked him in the eye. "I know you. I was you. And nobody showed up for me until I learned how to show up for myself. Now I show up for everyone." Leon nodded slowly. Darius turned, stepped out of the courtroom, into the sun. The system that once tried to break him was now being rebuilt, and the blueprint bore his name. Not as a defendant, but as a reckoning.